Great, thank you, Sarah. And today's a really topical information set today, given what's happening in the economy. But before we sort of go through what we're going to be talking about today, it's probably worth me just explaining where Colin and I met as a quick story, because it is relevant to what we're talking about today. About 7 years ago, both Colin and I were working at Rio Tinto, and I was tasked to evaluate HSE, health, safety and environmental risk globally. And in working with the procurement team, the global sourcing team out of Singapore, I was tasked to evaluate a bunch of different categories across a spend of about $15 billion. And the lucky winner of the category that I was to work with based on risk was Colin. So Colin was heading up the hydrocarbons category. So as you might appreciate, transporting ammonium nitrate from China into the Hunter Valley was full of both threats and opportunities, and ultimately ended up in Colin helping us as part of a critical control management program, which we'll talk a bit about later today. So we will talk more broadly around the economy and some of the macro factors affecting both contractors and suppliers. And along the way, feel free asking some questions through the chat, and hopefully we can share some tips and a few stories along the way. So a quick poll, if you wouldn't mind there, Sarah. We've been running the Health and Safety Index for a little while now, and just a quick question. What's the Health and Safety Index poorest result for contractors versus employees? So on the screen, there's 4 options there. So as part of the Health and Safety Index, we asked similar questions to what's on the screen at the moment. We slice and dice the information, and more recently we've developed some benchmarks and pulled out some interesting information, including comparing contractors versus employees. So we'll wait a few seconds for people to, I guess, have a guess on what they think the poorest result is, or the biggest gap between contractors and employees, and I can share with you the results when people are ready.
Okay, I'll just give it a couple more seconds because we're almost there with everybody. Okay, it's still coming in. Hold on. Okay, here are the results.
Okay, really interesting. So almost half the people had voted that feeling pressure to compromise safety, and closely followed by shortcuts and safety violations. And no one's selected bullying. Interesting. So although the actual Health and Safety Index result doesn't come up as a percentage to what we've described today, or the results as an average percentage of the callers, the actual difference between the results, or the poorest result, was B. So people guessed correctly in terms of it being the poorest result. A little bit later on the session, we'll go through and unpack that a little bit more and explain some factors why that might be the case, and be very interested to get some feedback from everyone on the call today as well. So Colin, you're the procurement expert here. So tell us, based on your observations in the last 6 to 12 months, what are some of the macro shifts you're seeing in the marketplace at the moment?
Colin, you'll have to unmute yourself.
There we go, just testing. Thanks, Mark, and hello, everybody. It's fantastic to be here with the BIOS sort of webinar and contributing some procurement and supply context into this conversation. It's probably not something that is normally done in a health and safety environment, but I think both groups are kind of linked in many ways, and certainly work with Mark and HSE teams quite often with clients as well in procurement and putting contracts together. But I guess for me, the question is out there to everybody is, have you ever seen such a crazy time as it is today in the supply chain world? I've been in supply chain for 21 years, and I've never seen so much chaos, I guess. And I want to share with you today some insights that I think that, you know, are becoming to feel a bit normal, but also stressing and putting a lot of pressure on companies and organizations as well. So, Mark, do you just want to go to the next slide and we'll just step our way through this one? I shouldn't be too long. So, yeah, in essence, what are your goods and the materials supply? You know, do you have less options and greater lead times? Well, if you go around Bunnings these days or some other large supermarkets even, there is definitely some stuff missing. I mean, I personally was trying to buy some rubber gloves the other day to do some painting here at home. And yeah, look, I couldn't get them in Bunnings, and also some specialized painting equipment, I couldn't get them. There's also some other products that are simply not available. Tiles at the moment are also short and are difficult to get hold of. So certainly from a personal perspective, we're seeing some of that building material becoming tighter and I guess less options as well. And compromising. Yeah, I guess we recently bought some tiles and we had to change the size because the ones we wanted we couldn't get until April of next year. So that was like us having to understand the supply chain ourselves and what does it mean. So and maybe to expand a little bit on that, Mark, what we'll do is go to the next slide. So what I want to do here is there's a little sort of well, I suppose a racetrack down the bottom here with goods, raw materials, supply chain, factory, supply chain, and then the customer. Now, that's a typical what I'm calling a make, move, and consume cycle. Now, within the make and move cycle, most people are aware, obviously, that when you're in manufacturing and producing goods and selling goods, there's usually a raw material involved. Today, if you're watching YouTube and CNN and all that, it won't come as a surprise to you that copper is now at a 10-year high. Aluminium is at levels not seen in a long, long time. We also know that rebar and lumber have recently been in the press globally. So there's a heck of a lot of shortage of raw materials. But the reality is, I don't think there's a lot of, the shortage isn't necessarily because it's not in the ground any longer or not necessarily being produced by the primary suppliers. One of the biggest issues we've got right now is the supply chain, and in particular, the sea supply chain, the containers, the break bulk. There's a lot of containers around the world stranded in different ports. For example, a lot of containers coming out of China, making their way into Australia, but because Australia isn't producing the same and shipping them back vis-a-vis, the wine isn't going back into China, many other things, right? There's a lot of stranded containers, and this is an example throughout the world. And, containerization prices have gone up. They've actually gone up ×4 and ×6 in some cases. And freight, there's been a lot of bottlenecks at various ports around the world. In particular, China has 5 or 6 of the largest ports in the world, and they've also been struggling with COVID and closed them down. This goes back to the supply issue of 18 months ago when the whole world closed down. And we're probably going to be in this mode for a while, actually, until we wait for a rebalancing within the supply chain. And because of that, we're going to see a lot of shortages. And as you guys already know, that the silicon chip shortage is something that is already been spoken about with the White House team in the US. The government's extremely concerned and they want to know a lot more what's going on there. So you're saying to yourself, well, I'm in HSE, Colin, what's that got to do with us? Well, what's also happening is as well at the factory and certainly at the supply chain land side, there's a lot of people shortages. And I think the story for us here in Australia in particular is around the borders and around the constraint of people. And I think, Mark, we can talk a little bit more about that in the next slide, I think.
Yeah, great, Colin. I think apart from materials, I know we're going to be talking about both skill shortages and contractors, but not being an economist, based on your view, Colin, the implications for the safety world here is, it just flows down and it cascades down into implications around cost, around time pressures, around business resources. And I've also had some personal dealings in terms of buying cars and things like that recently. And, there's lots of talk in the media around house prices and the mismatch between wages. What we are seeing, I guess, as putting the safety lens on now, is that those pressures are flowing down into the supply chain and impacting on individuals. So I guess as we go through today, I'd be really keen to get some feedback from people on the call through the chat, from examples of where they've had supply chain issues or pressures placed on them and the impact that has on safety. And a really good example there, and if people want to use the chat, there's a couple of questions here, Colin, that you've put together. And these are questions for people on the call today. You can use the chat. Are you experiencing labour shortages or skill shortages? And that could be part of your safety team, or it could be part of your operations team. And beyond price, are there any strategies that you've got in place to be able to attract good talent, both your contracted talent and also your employees? So, Colin, I'm starting to see a few people answer those questions now, but feel free to elaborate on that and let me know how you'd like me to negotiate the presentation.
Yeah, no, look, fine. I think if you go to the next slide back, I think we'll put some meat on the bone here if we can.
No problem. So we've got both Ian and John agreeing these shortages are certainly impacting them. Yeah. Look, and hopefully, hopefully we get a couple more. But I think this slide here, park up here for a minute. There's two reasons for this slide. Obviously, first of all, the Great Resignation. There is certainly, I think, under COVID, a mental process going on with people. Certainly for people working from home, obviously now, having a lot more time to reflect on their goals and personal lives, and do I still want to work for this company? There's definitely a lot of that going on here, and I think, Mark, you make a good point by bringing this up here. But ultimately, I think that's a new phenomena. But I think what's been actually a more older phenomena, which hasn't been addressed, is for example, the truck driver situation. In Australia, I've been heavily involved with the logistics community, and I've been doing some research. And what is interesting is that, there is the average age of a global truck driver in these four is 50 years old right now. And it's obviously increasing. There's a lot of questions. Well, why is the trucking industry in particular, this one, so unattractive? Well, as we all know, right, in long hours, the pay isn't necessarily huge when you break it down to $1 per hour. There's time pressure on people. Certainly key performance indicators are in contracts. And people are held to account, certainly in the supply chain world these days. And right now what we've seen is a fuel crisis in the UK. And I think it's an important part here for us to think about, certainly in Australia. We've got, obviously, the States are pretty much locked down. But if you think of the UK in the last sort of 2 to 3 weeks, massive problem with fuel supply. And in particular, that is an island, obviously, so you don't have the migration of people, a little bit like what we've got in Australia, and they're 100,000 short of drivers. And not only they're short, but the current drivers that they've got are also, getting on in age as well. So what we're seeing here is very much a supply chain problem on the land, so to speak, as I'm talking about my process earlier on, and in particular, an example where, with borders closed, there's no sort of movement of labour. I have got other clients as well who have got one client, they've got 70 vacancies, and they simply can't get hold of enough people in the state that they're in. And so in particular, a couple of weeks ago, I put out a post on my LinkedIn that procurement roles, there were 24% more vacancies for procurement people than there were 4 months ago. It's not that people aren't trying, it's people can't move. And I think, that's putting a lot of stress on not only individuals, it's putting stress on companies as well.
And I think this whole story about being captured within the border is obviously having a stressful time, with individuals and companies, and it's manifesting itself to, dare I say, compromising on a lot of systems, process, and dare I say it, some values as well, Mark. And I think the next slide, I think, really highlights this.
Yeah, look, definitely, Colin. And, the safety community often talk around both lead and lag indicators. And these macro events are probably a good lead indicator, not necessarily of safety, health and safety performance, but a lead indicator on how you might want to start thinking about managing risk. If we know that this demand and supply issue is not going to be solved overnight, are organisations and teams starting to think around, well, what are these implications to their workforce and their business, and how they're best going to manage them?
Yeah, I think so. So this one, look, I think here, compromising on safety, and I can see a couple of really cool comments coming through as well about seeing interim controls being required. I think this slide talks a little bit to that, but on the left-hand side here, where we've got the black and white, the black and yellow banner, but when supply is short, have you experienced operations that make do, compromise, and throw out the rule book? And look, keen to hear the commentary from the audience, but I want to overlay that with the picture on the right-hand side. Look, I've taken the name of the company off. It's that's not important here, but this has come from social media. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I actually think it actually calls out what's going on at the moment with compromise. So the story here was that the guy on the left, John from London, he was congratulated for passing his heavy goods vehicle test after a small incident during the test. Well, if you look at the truck, I mean, it's hardly a small incident, isn't it? But the story here is that, if this was normal times with maybe pre-COVID, plenty of people moving around, you can be quite selective on who you select. But here, look, they're desperate for people. They need trucks. The army's been called into the UK. So this was a meme. This is not a genuine one, but I thought it captured the essence of the risks that people are willing to take, or companies, etc., because of shortages of goods. People will make do, people will compromise, and people will sometimes throw out the rule book because they're under pressure. And I think that goes back to your poll, right, Mark? I think the poll results were feeling pressured to compromise on safety. And I think if we link that back to the poll, and this is what it looks like, or what it could look like, is the scenario where you're happy to accept, the lowest, if not the worst case scenario. And how does the procurement team, the health and safety team, when putting a contract together, how do we flex the contract in a way that we can assure supply to the organization, but also making sure that we don't have any major fatalities, health and safety risks, and we keep the integrity of the system in place. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge that, the HSE community and the procurement community have got right now, certainly in the inbound space for goods and services.
Yeah, true, Colin. I think when the stats around compromising safety really is a bit of just an indicator of the nature of contracting. Often it's short-term specialised work, an extension of the workforce. You're zipping in, zipping out. So I think overlay that with all these other things that you're talking about, it's potentially the perfect storm for some organisations in terms of their risk profile, depending on the nature of their business and activity that's being performed. Catherine's also just raised a really good point here, is that the pool of experienced workers is limited too. So you can see the sort of knock-on effect here around the potential issues that organisations are going to continue to face. And if they want to continue to operate, what sort of contingency plans are going to be put in place to do that? And as we sort of walk through the rest of the presentation, hopefully we can sort of provide a few little tips and tricks along the way there too. So the next slide, Colin, again, happy for people to jump on the chat there. What you can see here is a little infographic on a typical contractor life cycle. Appreciate that each organisation could be slightly different. So for the people on the call, use the chat if you feel comfortable. Where in your contractor life cycle do you find the greatest challenges? Be that in the selection phase, when you're sourcing some contractors, through the engagement or pre-qualification process that you have, excuse me, the mobilisation, induction, management, and the monitoring and review. Be really interested to understand people on the call today in the chat, 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5, jump in there. Provide us a bit of an indicator where you're finding the biggest challenges. What we have seen some organisations do is start to map out across their life cycle a bit of a risk profile, so they can better manage risk, so they can better come up with some solid controls, improved controls around the life cycle of the contractors. We've also worked with some organisations to actually help them with their software as well, in terms of understanding their requirements prior to selecting and deploying software. So the principles remain the same, that most organisations have some sort of life cycle. Some people focus, they've got a bias for focusing up front around the pre-qualification and then just let the contractor do their thing. Others, depending on the nature of what they do, might focus on other areas. So Ian's responded here with 1, 2, 3 and 4. Someone else has responded with 4 and 5, which is pretty common. Usually the desktop component can be quite straightforward for a lot of organisations that have got some solid systems in place up front. And actually the implementation of behaviours on site can be another struggle again. So I'll continue on the slide here, Colin, and we'll start to talk a little bit more around contractor management. And Colin's got a lot of expertise in this area, particularly contracts. But here are some, research and data points. One's from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. They published an article back into 2019 saying that of the top 200 ASX listed companies in 2018, 70% of fatalities were related to contractors. There's another research article there published in September 2020, and they've called out in this journal article 4 key areas where organisations really struggle around contractor management, around safety, and that's the variability of the work, communication from top layers of the organisation, and that communication and safety messaging filtering through to the front line. The expertise of work versus safety. So often contracts and contractors are evaluated based on the ability to do operational work, which makes complete sense. Trying to overlay that to evaluate safety performance at the front end often is quite difficult. Some organisations have a go, no-go zone around their pre-qual. Other organisations have different ways to manage that risk. But certainly there's a big difference between evaluating capability of people to perform the work versus performing it safely. And the final one, which really ties in with, our findings with the Health and Safety Index surveys, is time pressures, taking shortcuts or cutting corners as being another call out around contractors. And again, that's probably just an indicator of the nature of the work that they're doing too, albeit not an excuse for those sorts of behaviours. We've also got another response here in the chat calling out JSA permits and inductions being a real struggle with contractors. So through that management phase of the contractor life cycle. So if we just understand and at least acknowledge there's a lot of information out there in the marketplace around some of these challenges, both at a macro level and specifically dealing with contractors. the challenge now is, well, how do we actually manage that effectively? So there's a QR code on the screen. So hopefully most people know how to use a QR code now. Feel free to use that. We've got a blog with a bunch of articles and information which describe not only the contractor safety results, but some other benchmark data and a few tips and tricks on, things that you might want to consider in terms of improving health and safety, not only of contractors, but there's some articles in there around fatigue, mental health and wellbeing as well. So as an extension of what Colin's already spoken about, this is almost like the end result. It's not necessarily a cause, but certainly an indicator of what, not what I'm saying or my research. This is what thousands and thousands of people across Australia and New Zealand in particular are telling us. This is what their observations are in the workplace. So compared to contractors and employees, you can see, as we've spoken about already, pressure to compromise safety is the biggest variability, but we're also seeing some outages in other areas. Surprisingly though, out of the 55 questions in the survey that we do use, contractors actually, their results were actually better across the board compared to employees. So this paints a pretty dire picture around contractors, but these are just the lowest results, and majority of performance was actually quite solid. So, but I guess it's also, I guess, very valid, particularly in light of some of the conversations we had already around contractor management and the supply chain.
I think there's also an element here as well, Mark, having, certainly for heyProcurement, we certainly get involved supporting clients with contractor management and in particular contract management, right? Which is, making sure that the contractor's following the contract. But I think there's also a learning here as well for the organizations who are employing contractors, because if you look at, for example, taking shortcuts and pressure to compromise on safety, what I've also come across with large organization is that a contractor may well have been awarded a contract to like a facilities management company to run and operate, for example, the facility, they've got maybe a month to get up to speed, where the employees there have actually had a long time to understand how the operating manual. One particular client of mine had an operating manual of about 600 pages thick, double-sided, right? So, I think that there is a need on both sides, both the company who is looking for the service providers to do a good service, to make it as simple and as clear as possible. So, shortcuts aren't taken, because it depends what the shortcuts are, right? I mean, if it's a 600-page document with 200 or 300 process steps that they've done a shortcut on, well, I guess sometimes there is an improvement on the specification side that's required as well. So I think, pressure to compromise on safety. Well, yeah, if you're a contractor, quite often you could be there for a certain amount of time. You're not an employee. You have a start, a middle, and an end. But equally, the specification, 9 times out of 10, the excuse given back to the people delivering the service was, well, you knew what it was in the tender. But you know what? 9 times out of 10, people who've got to do the work, the contractor, isn't the person that was actually responding to the tender. They're completely two different animals. The business development team and the execution team are two different people. But, and I think sometimes, certainly in procurement, I'm quite aware that I could well be talking to the person that's not going to deliver the service. And therefore, sometimes I've got to challenge the business and say, well, look, is there any way we can simplify this as well? Because all you're going to end up with is a suboptimal outcome,
Yeah, and look, Colin, that's a really good segue into the next, phase of this presentation around the trade-off between compliance and culture. I know certainly when we were working together, Colin, that handover process between the sourcing team and the people that actually had to deliver the contract was really important, and having HSE or risk professionals right at the very front end of the sourcing process made that transition much easier and much easier to manage risk. And in terms of making life easier, it's an ongoing question that we get around, well, how do you make life easy? Because, you know, if by nature contractors do feel like they're under pressure and they are having to compromise safety, the last thing you want to do is get them to fill out a massive pre-qualification process or jump through a bunch of red tape if it's not completely necessary. So, you know, there's lots of different ways around simplifying and removing clutter and all those things that organisations commonly do. Another interesting approach is to start to try and segment your contractors and suppliers. So if you think about the work that organisations can do to differentiate between contractors based on risk or size or the nature of the work, it lends itself to potentially making life easier for people. So rather than having a one size fits all, there could be an ability to actually simplify the process or simplify the way that you engage and collaborate with businesses. I was working with a client recently with some Federal Safety Commissioner work, and there's a specific piece in there around IRAC or risk management processes around subcontractor management. They were providing a go, no-go pre-qualification process, and they said they didn't need to differentiate. They were quite happy with the way that they're running their contractors. One of the questions I asked was, are you having any issues with your contractors? And then the project manager and about 3 other people behind him started to give us all these complaints around poor performing contractors. So my initial response was, how do you differentiate based on performance, and how can you better manage and get a better outcome based on segmenting your contractors on performance? So this changed the whole conversation around it, going from a compliance exercise to meet Federal Safety Commissioner obligations to, hang on a second, we can actually use this to add value to our business. This is just a really simple model. So if we take the example that I had with Colin 7 years ago, hydrocarbons was in a top corner of the quadrant, and we had professional services down the other end of the quadrant. So that helped us very quickly, based on the criteria that we put together, that aligned with the organisational strategy and the procurement strategy, to really target and segment categories of contractors and even contracting companies based on different parameters. So for some organisations, that could be threats, it could be opportunities, it could be value of the contract, it could be the performance of the contractor, it could be the activity that's being performed, it could be a whole range of different things based on even the project life cycle, where they're at in the project. And this could be a dynamic process, but in very simple terms, you know, we encourage organisations to start thinking outside the box a little bit in terms of differentiating a little bit and keeping life simple, but not necessarily throwing a whole bunch of paperwork at suppliers and asking them to all fill out lengthy processes if it's not completely necessary.
I think on that one, Mark, I think maybe the old adage that 80% of your risk sits with 20% of your suppliers, you know, where I've seen the view that 100% of the risk sits with 100% of the suppliers. So, well, that's just going to, you know, I think as Nick Christie has just written on here and said that, you know, I found separating contractors and providers of goods and providers of services a simple way to establish more robust systems around management. I think that's a fantastic, mature comment, you know, with regards to segregating suppliers around the risk profile and in particular critical risk as well at the cornerstone of it.
Fantastic. So moving on to, I guess, stage 3 then around engagement of this presentation today. Now we'll talk about different ways to engage contractors and suppliers. So, you know, differentiating, understanding those contractors or categories of goods and services that you actually want to focus on allows you to then allocate resources accordingly. Unfortunately, Colin and I got to intimately know each other, and we spent a lot of time together talking about ammonium nitrate, whereas the professional services team I didn't necessarily spend as much time with because it certainly wasn't a priority. And the way that Colin engaged his contracting teams, the Shells, the Chevrons on the world was very different to the way that we engage other contractors and suppliers, based on return on investment. Doing that segmentation up front is really important. In terms of collaborating with both contractors and suppliers, if you ask compliance questions and you just focus on basic compliance questions, the chances are you're going to get a very basic compliant culture. But if you start to shift those conversations, shift your process or shift the mindset around collaborating with your contractors and suppliers, particularly those that are prioritised, there are some great opportunities to be able to leverage expertise, create innovation, improve risk controls, and again, there's a whole different ways to be able to do that. Certainly, apart from basic pre-qual, we do encourage larger organisations to use surveys to be able to understand how their contractors are thinking and feeling, because often you just don't have the visibility of your contractors and suppliers, particularly if they're working in remote locations. There could be different methods of workshops or meetings or whatever. Colin, from your point of view, in terms of engaging and collaborating with suppliers, I recall you using social media a lot back at Rio Tinto, but there are other really simple ways you can give some advice on how to better collaborate with contractors and suppliers.
Yeah, look, I mean, what one really good example sort of I can give here was that each I think it was each quarter with one large ASX company, they would have a positive share with the company. Whether it would be they would put a lean board up and they would put it on a bit of a PowerPoint, and then we would share that around. That was a value add, or we would move some fleet from point A to point B to a safer location. We would make a one-page, I guess, success story, we called them. And after 12 months, what we did then was we had an album. We called it the improvement album. And that album actually was then circulated right across the business. It was, there was no IP. It was about safety. It was about improvement. And it was a nice glossy story, as you could imagine, on a PowerPoint. There was a picture. There was a story, what the problem was, what the two partners did together. And it generated a collaborative narrative. Because quite often, we just do things, we do good things every day with our external partners, but we don't necessarily capture it. And I think sometimes we've got to capture the story, and the value add becomes when you share that around with a wider network, actually creates momentum and further thinking. And you get people that will challenge it, but most people will take it away and have a look at how they can apply that, maybe in a different scenario. So for me, certainly it's about sometimes obviously giving a lot of credit to your provider, celebrating the success, showing how you are both sort of making things better for each other, for the contractor or the partner. For them, it's about innovation and something that they can use to build their business, where for procurement and the HSE team, it could be seen as, hey, look, we've got the right partner, they're doing the right things, and we've got some evidence here for it. So yeah, moving from, as you said, Mark, on this graph here, moving from left to right on the x-axis, I think, it's going to take time. It takes trust. It takes commitment. And you look, and in the end, if you follow it and stick to the discipline, you get good results.
Thanks, Colin. So we'll move on, given we've probably got about 20 minutes left, and we want to allow a little bit of time for Q&A as well. So the second last section of the presentation is around measurement. So here's just a really simple example of different ways organisations can measure health and safety. I appreciate that there is no one way, and it's, again, quite a polarising conversation for many. I usually advise clients to align any sort of metrics that they want to measure with their their strategy. Whatever metrics are used, obviously you want to try and ensure that they're driving the right behaviour and don't have any unintended consequences. But the model here just throws up some examples around considering both lead and lag indicators, understanding internal regulatory drivers versus external regulatory drivers. I mean, a really good example there would be to have some sort of contractual arrangement in place where, or some sort of expectation where, if there was a serious incident or a notifiable incident that needed to be reported, is that the contractor's actually informed you about it. From a very basic compliance reactive point of view through to some more mature organisations are using, the ICMM framework to really understand critical controls and collaborating with contractors around not telling them how to do their job, but working with them to ensure that those critical controls are effective. Through to some other frameworks in place are in the oil and gas industry, which has got a little bit more focus on potential consequence and different measures in and around how you might frame up some of that reporting to better understand some of those metrics as well. So in terms of, a risk-based way of improvement, we've spoken about using risk already up front in terms of segmenting contractors, certainly understanding the risk throughout the life cycle of the contract is going to be really important, and tying that back into what you're measuring. Here's a really simple little example or activity that we perform as part of our contractor workshops we do with organisations. So Sarah, if you're still with us, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the poll. And there's no one right or wrong answer here, by the way. The question is, do your systems, I say typically some sort of management system or technology, treat all contractors equally? And the example given here is you've got two window cleaning organisations. Both are performing very similar activity, high risk work at height. One's usually a one-off type of a scenario, and the other one's a large 5-year contract. Contractor one, small organisation. Contractor two, a multinational. So you can see here there's the common components is the high risk work that they're performing, and the variability is the size of the organisation and the length of the contract. As people start thinking about the yes or no, we asked a very similar question as part of a workshop recently, and we had one organisation say they've got very rigid systems around pre-qualification, and they absolutely, all contractors must go through the same rigorous process, which is absolutely fine for that organisation, whereas someone else in the room said, no, we tailor-make our sourcing and selection process. And in the back end, it was almost the opposite. So obviously there's lots of variability here based on, the nature of the organisation and the contractor at play, but it would be very interesting to understand from people today on whether or not your systems do treat all contractors equally, or there is an ability to have some flexibility in there.
Okay, I just leave it a couple of seconds and then, all right. Share that now.
Oh, it's almost a 50-50 split, Sarah. So we've got 54% of people saying yes, they do have systems that treat all contractors equally. So there's not a lot of differentiation in there. And then 46% saying no. So you can see here, clearly there's not one way to do this, but certainly as you start thinking about improving the way that you manage contractors across the whole life cycle, is understand whether or not those systems need to be quite rigid, or whether there's some flexibility in there. A really good example is your contract. Is it a purchase order? Is it some sort of short-term contract, or is it a 5-year contract? And are those contracts all going to have the same health and safety requirements? I'm certainly not going to say that they do. It really depends on the nature of the organisation, but certainly having a thinking about some of these things and reflecting and working in with your procurement teams could be a really good opportunity to improve and collaborate with your contractors and your suppliers. So apart from understanding how you might treat contractors differently, another thing to think about is trying to understand what controls you might put in place as an organisation, or what controls your contractors might have in place. And often based on your role within the organisation, based on the nature of the contract, whether you're a head contractor, whether it's a labour hire arrangement, whether it's a short-term contract, a white-collar arrangement where you're providing all of the direction, your ability to understand the role, the influence and control that you do have, really will help inform how you would then manage that contractor or supplier. If we take the example that Colin and I used a few years ago now, the importation of ammonium nitrate from China into the Hunter Valley had a range of different factors that needed to be considered. And our ability to really understand how effective those controls were across the supply chain and the life cycle of the actual contract was quite involved, given the potential consequence it had of transporting such a large quantity of ammonium nitrate. You certainly wouldn't want an ignition source anywhere near a ship or a truck. And Colin, I'm not sure if you recall the story around us trying to engage the operations around the concept of this potential risk of transporting ammonium nitrate. But the day before the workshop, an unnamed competitor of Rio Tinto actually had a truck rollover, and there was talks of this explosion being a little bit like an earthquake, and the aftermath of the ammonium nitrate going up certainly wasn't pretty. So, I mean, the nature of the conversation today is certainly we're not going to get into critical control management and how you do that. More around a consideration when you are managing contractors and suppliers is, are you effectively managing those critical controls? Does it align with your major unwanted events? Is there a mechanism there to identify your critical controls, communicate, set expectations of some description? Colin, from your example, from your experience, can you provide any examples where either with your role in the hydrocarbons unit at Rio Tinto or even in your current capacity where you see critical controls actually adding value to the nature of the engagement and the commercial arrangements?
Yeah, so I think the word here, like you said, Mark, contractor, right, which by definition means there's a contract there. There's some examples, I think, right across industry that I've worked with where health and safety isn't necessarily clearly embedded in the contract. And I think it's more important now than ever that health and safety is very clearly called out in the governance framework. So if there is a contractor monthly report, it would be essential that you would have, for example, the HSE monthly figures coming out, and if you don't get that every month, well, that in itself is an indicator of, well, why didn't we get it, let alone not understanding what your safety systems are. So I think sort of the basics of that is important. And then putting health and safety on the scorecard, the balance scorecard, the dashboard, call it what you want. I think that's important, but it also needs to be written in the contract that the contractor will provide its health and safety performance in a dashboard every month, and then make it contractual. If they don't, you've got a really strong opportunity then to go back through the contract and make it reinforceable. You may think this is simple stuff, but it's not necessarily in all contracts. But the example I can give you is, in particular for critical controls and a leading indicator. For example, you take freight. Quite often freight is loaded to a certain weight on an axle Well, you know, if a trucking company goes to a weigh bridge and it's over the weight, that should be recorded, put into the database and reported then to yourselves. Because what you want to know is, let's say over a quarter, you've had 7 breaches, or your suppliers had 7 breaches. Well, that's an indicator that things aren't right? And you've got to address that with them and say, hang on a second, you know, we've got 3 per quarter because, you know, there's always a variation. Now you're on 7, it's a red light, come in, it's in the contract, we want a conversation with you. Because I have seen it before where these examples are around them, the buyer or the team who procure the service have challenged the supplier, and they says, well, basically, Mr. Buyer, it's not in the contract, so we'll do what we want. And I've seen that a couple of times, actually. So being quite clear what your critical risks are, having them understood, put them into the contract if they're important to you, 5 or 6 of them, and then track and maintain. But make sure they're in the contract, because then you can call breach, and then you can performance manage the contract. So yeah, call it out, understand it, and put it into the contract. And then you know, I think that's step 1, basically.
Thanks, Colin. And certainly dealing with the Shells and the Chevrons on the world make it easy to report on dashboards. I'm just contemplating the people on the call scratching their head saying, how am I going to get my little contractor to give me a dashboard? But I think, you know, based on our experience, Colin, where the resources and the nature of the contract allows for that, it certainly can be really powerful. We're going to tie things up in a second. Chris has also provided another comment in the chat here around having different processes to fulfill requirements based on size, frequency, and risk. So thank you, Chris. So I guess just to wrap things up, you know, 4 things that we're seeing at the moment, and certainly some valuable information from Colin around what's happening in the economy at the moment, is that there is a mismatch between supply and demand, be that materials supply, skills shortages of people, both employees and contractors, and contractor management. This is having an impact on job demands and resources. There's been lots of research out there and very topical at the moment around psychosocial risk and the impact of the mismatch between job resources and job demands. And obviously, you know, that plays out in physical safety activity as well. Colin spoke a lot about compromising values. So when people are under pressure, when there's a squeeze on money, or when there's time pressures, it's human nature for under pressure styles to come out, and sometimes it's not pretty. But certainly being aligned with values so you can make some tough calls, and having really effective leaders who know when to compromise and know when to actually draw the line is certainly really important, particularly in tough times. And then just to wrap things up, you know, another really important factor around performance of both contractors and suppliers is really understanding what your critical few are. You know, allocating your resources accordingly, and having some sort of mechanism to ensure that those controls are actually effective. So, you know, the old quality versus quantity, certainly focusing on quality has lots of benefits. So, Sarah, we'll wrap things up there. There are QR codes on the presentation there if people want to connect in any way. There's links and things to our website as well. But we've got a few minutes now, Sarah, for people to fire some questions. Hopefully some tough ones all lined up for Colin and not myself, but certainly we're open to answering any questions that people might have.
Okay. Hopefully we'll get a couple of questions just now, but I did get a couple in emails before this event. So, sorry. One was, what is the importance of WHS? Sorry. What is the importance of WHS clauses in contracts?
So I think Colin's almost answered that one already, I think, in terms of particularly the compliance and legal aspects of it. You know, you'd like to think that in turn then drives the right behaviour and culture as well. Colin, is there anything else you wanted to add, noting the time?
No, I think just participate. I think for health and safety people, they often don't get to participate in the specification writing in tenders, and they usually get involved when the incident has happened and they're doing incident investigation. I'd encourage the health and safety teams to get, if they can, get in there early and influence the specification before it goes out, so it can be written up accordingly in the contract.
Okay, another question that came in via email. What examples can you give when leading indicators give rise to conversations with contractors?
Yeah, I think that earlier one about the freight one was and the actuator may well have covered that one. So and I think another one is maybe the drug and alcohol testing, right? If that is also a good place to think about leading indicators and tracking that and making sure those things happen. I've seen quite a few contracts with that explicitly called out, and I think most company policies have those. But equally, so is maintenance of assets, because if you stop spending money on maintaining your assets, that could also be a leading indicator to think about. Okay, well, this could turn ugly if organizations suddenly don't repair their taxis or their Ubers, for example, and they run them to the ground. You don't want to be traveling in one of those scenarios. But these are the questions that need to be asked. Is how is your budget? Can you show us your spend? Are you on spend? And if they tell you, oh no, we've done a 10% cost saving this year on our maintenance, to me that's a red flag. I'd be worried, and I want to know why.
Okay, well, we don't have any more questions. I will put a link to your website in the chat to everyone. And yes, we do have a question that always.
I think there is a question there actually from Michelle.
Yes, do you want to read it, Colin, or do you want me to?
Look, you go ahead.
Michelle asked, many contracts just state must follow WHS legislation and company safety management system without much detail. I have advised companies to be more specific, but they seem to be resistant.
So I think Colin spoke a little bit about the benefits of being more prescriptive in your contracts. On the flip side, that there are other ways that you can set expectations without them necessarily just being in the contract. But often it's a balance between being overly prescriptive, telling the contractor exactly what to do and how to do it, versus giving them information around your hazards and letting them control the risks and being reasonably reliant on them to do so. Certainly not a one-size-fits-all response, but a good question nevertheless.
Okay. All right. Well, I've shared a link to your website, which I know has some good blog information on there too. So we're right on time. So thank you very much, Mark, Colin. We'll send out those emails later today. If anyone has any questions, they can contact your organisation. The link will be on the email as well. So thanks for joining us.
No, thank you. And yeah, if anybody needs a bit of help putting health and safety into the contracts and some commercial stuff, obviously heyProcurement's happy to provide some guidance and some support, and yeah, help you work on the commercials.
Okay, thank
Right.
you everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for joining us. Bye. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.